Welcome to Breaking News to Trading Moves. Today we're looking at the market reaction when a policy, specifically U.S. export controls, gets involved in the semiconductor supply chain. We're focusing on the companies that make the incredibly complex tools for producing advanced chips. The industry calls it wafer fab equipment, or WFE.
Right, and the event that really brought this all into focus was the recent guidance from Applied Materials, AMAT.
AMAT, okay.
Their stock reacted pretty negatively when they announced they expect these U.S. export limits will curb China's spending on chip-making tools.
And not just for a little while, right?
No, throughout 2026. This isn't just a market trend. It's a policy actively reallocating a massive amount of capital.
Okay, so let's frame this for you. China is the single biggest market for this chip equipment. So the central question is, when Washington tightens these rules, putting limits on where U.S. tools can be sold, where does all that capital expenditure, that CapEx, actually go? We have to figure out who gets pushed out and who's positioned to step in and fill that void.
And we have to start with AMAT. Their exposure really makes them the canary in the coal mine for this policy.
So how bad is the hit?
Their orders from China have already dropped quite a bit. They were sitting near 40% of their total revenue.
Wow, 40%.
And now they're down in the mid 20% range. That is a huge piece of their top line that's now tied directly to geopolitical decisions.
And it seems like the U.S. government is actively trying to close any known loopholes so that decline isn't just going to level off.
Precisely. This isn't just about keeping the old rules. It's about tougher enforcement. Washington is making the definitions stricter, stopping Chinese firms from using affiliates or subsidiaries to just bypass the controls.
Making them stickier.
Exactly. And this matters a whole lot because if you're a WFE company, U.S. policy is now deciding the size of your market in, well, the biggest market in the world for what you sell. It's dictating who gets access.
So if that capital is being pushed away from certain U.S. vendors, we need to see where it lands. Let's move to the groups identified as the beneficiaries, the winners in all of this.
The first group that comes to mind are the non-U.S. equipment vendors and the big foundry leaders.
Okay, so we're talking about companies like ASML and TSM, which is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. But it's not just about where they're located, is it? Yeah. What's the technical reason that gives a company like ASML an edge over Applied Materials here?
Well, the advantage is all about what technology is being controlled versus what isn't. U.S. export rules are really focused on stopping sales of leading-edge equipment, a lot of it tied to deep ultraviolet or DUV lithography. But ASML, they have a global monopoly on the next step up. Extreme ultraviolet, EUV.
UV, right, the absolute cutting edge.
The only way to make chips at 7 nanometer and below. So while the U.S. and its allies restrict EUV access, ASML can still sell some of its older DUV tools into China.
Tools that a U.S. vendor might not be able to ship because of all the U.S. components inside.
Exactly. It's a subtle but crucial distinction.
So ASML benefits because their main product, EUV, keeps them essential globally, and the tools they can sell are less restricted than the U.S. equivalents.
That's it. And TSM benefits because they're the ones buying all this advanced gear. Their expansion outside of China is huge, which means massive CapEx spending that benefits any global supplier who can sell to them.
Okay, let's move to the second group of winners, the AI chip designers. This seems almost separate from the manufacturing rules.
It is, for the most part, decoupled. Even with all these limits on equipment sales to China, the demand for advanced chips in the U.S. and allied countries is just astronomical.
I mean, for data centers.
Yes. Cloud providers, enterprise AI, they're all building out data centers. The spending on AI chips is in the hundreds of billions.
And that demand just keeps fueling the growth for companies like NVDA
NVDA
and AMD. Advanced Micro Devices, their market is focused on selling that final high-value product.
Right. Their growth is tied to the U.S. and Western cloud CapEx cycle, which isn't affected by these equipment rules at all. You could even argue it makes them more essential to the global market.
Which leads us right into the third group of beneficiaries. All the onshoring efforts, like the Cheap EPS Act.
It's a logical consequence. If policy restricts leading-edge tool access in China, that manufacturing capacity has to be built somewhere else. So there's a greater chance that the strategic investment, the actual building of new plants, will happen in the U.S. and Europe.
And just so you're clear, when we say foundries, we mean companies that manufacture chips for other companies.
That's right, contract manufacturers. So this policy directly supports domestic players like Intel,
INTC,
and global foundries, GFS. Intel is scaling up its foundry services, and they're a huge recipient of cheap PSS money to build those domestic fabs. Global Foundries is a pure-play foundry, also benefiting from that push to bring CapEx home.
So it's a complex dynamic. The U.S. government is steering CapEx away from Chinese fabs, which hurts some U.S. equipment makers, while also subsidizing CapEx for domestic fabs, which helps U.S. manufacturers build capacity here. It's a policy-driven market adjustment. All right, now let's look at the flip side, the losers, the U.S. companies that are really exposed to the revenue loss from these restrictions.
Yeah, the pain definitely starts at the front lines with the U.S. wafer fab equipment makers themselves, the WFE group.
We've talked a lot about AMAT. Who else is feeling this?
KLA Corporation, KLAC is another big one. They make essential process control and inspection equipment. You can't make chips without it.
So they're in the same boat.
Very much so. Their management is already telling shareholders to expect revenue headwinds. They're cutting costs to prepare for what looks like a long-term policy environment. They have to completely reorient their strategy away from what was their fastest-growing market.
And that downturn flows through the whole supply chain, right? Which brings us to another group of losers. Other U.S. tool makers tied to that China CapEx.
Absolutely. This includes critical firms like Lam Research.
That's LRCX.
And Onto Innovation, ONNTO. Lam is a leader in etching and deposition core manufacturing steps. If Chinese fabs slow down or delay expansion because they can't get certain restricted U.S. tools, suppliers like Lam see their backlogs get weaker and their earnings become much more volatile.
Okay, and then there's a final category, one that might fly under the radar for many people, the component and subsystem suppliers.
Yes, this group is really important because they often operate on much tighter margins. These are the smaller, highly specialized companies that supply parts for the big WFE tools, things like fluid systems or special lasers.
So how does the impact scale down to them? If Applied Materials ships, say, 15% fewer tools to China, what does that mean for one of its component suppliers?
The effect gets amplified. Think of them as specialized factories that serve just a few big customers. When a big toolmaker like AMAT ships fewer machines, these smaller suppliers immediately get lower volume orders. Their revenue becomes highly cyclical and really constrained.
So that would hit a company like Coherent Corp, COHR, which makes key optical components.
Exactly. It shows that rules placed on the final machine, they affect the entire ecosystem right down to the laser supplier. Coherent and others like them see that volume drop and have to adjust everything. It's a tough adjustment to a suddenly smaller market. So to sum it up, the tightening of these U.S. rules is actively directing global capital spending for chip equipment. It's moving that CapEx away from certain U.S. vendors with heavy China exposure and pushing it toward less restricted international companies like ASML and toward the big AI-driven build-out happening in allied nations.
And that brings us back to the Central Balancing Act. We know U.S. equipment vendors are losing a major revenue source in China. But on the other hand, global AI data center CapEx is booming. So here's the final thought for you to consider. Can the sustained, massive demand from AI data center spending in the U.S. and allied countries, demand that fuels both the foundries and the AI chip designers, truly make up for the lost revenue from China for these WFE companies? That equation really is the future of the entire equipment sector.
And we do want to remind you that the discussion presented here is based purely on the information and opinions of the original author or authors of the material we reviewed. This content is for educational purposes only. It is not financial advice or a recommendation to buy or sell any securities.